At dinner, my brother-in-law burst in and snapped my arm like it was nothing, and as I collapsed in agony, my own sister just smiled and whispered that I would always be a failure. I am Olivia, and that night was the moment I realized my family was never a sanctuary, but a battlefield where I was left to bleed. The clinking of silverware against porcelain filled the dining room, but underneath it all, there was a tension I could feel pressing against my skin. The clinking of silverware against porcelain filled the dining room, but underneath it all, there was a tension I could feel pressing against my skin. The long oak table gleamed under the chandelier, and the air smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic. My parents sat at the head exchanging polite words with Sophia, who looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine in her emerald dress. Daniel sat beside her, his broad shoulders rigid, his eyes shifting too quickly as if searching for an excuse to ignite. I kept my gaze on the glass of water in front of me, tracing the condensation with my finger. I tried to steady my breath, tried to blend into the background. Tonight was supposed to be just another family dinner, but my gut told me that something darker was crawling beneath the surface. Sophia laughed at something my mother said, leaning back so the pearls around her neck caught the light. It was the kind of laugh that reminded me of every time she'd made me feel smaller, weaker, unnecessary. My father poured himself more wine and looked away from me as if I was barely there. That was always the role I played in this house, the shadow at the edge of their perfect picture. Daniel's chair scraped against the floor, sharp and sudden, cutting the air like a blade. The sound made my body stiffen. He turned his head toward me, and I saw the anger flaring in his face before he even spoke. His lips curled, his jaw clenched, and in that moment, I knew something was about to happen. I shifted slightly, instinct telling me to move to get away, but I was too slow. Daniel stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. In 2 strides he was next to me. I barely had time to look up before his hand clamped down on my arm. His grip was iron, and his eyes were wild, unblinking. There was a flash of white-hot pain as he twisted. I heard it before I fully felt it, the sickening snap that echoed louder than any voice in the room. My scream tore through the air, but it sounded far away, muffled, as if I was underwater. My arm collapsed against me, useless, a fire of agony rushing up to my shoulder. The room froze. My father's wine glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the hardwood floor, the red spilling out like blood. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Forks clattered as guests at the far end of the table pushed their chairs back, eyes wide in shock. I gasped for air, clutching my broken arm against my chest, and turned toward Sophia. She was still seated, her back perfectly straight, her expression untouched by the chaos around her. Then slowly, deliberately, her lips curved into a smile. The kind of smile that cut deeper than Daniel's violence. A smile of victory, of cruelty, of satisfaction. She didn't flinch at my pain, didn't move to stop her husband, didn't even look surprised. Her voice was calm, almost sweet when it came. "You'll always be a failure." The words slid into me like a knife, colder than the ache in my bones. My vision blurred not only from the pain, but from the betrayal. My legs gave way, and I crumpled to the floor, my good hand grasping for balance, but finding nothing. The chandelier above buzzed faintly, the light flickering. All around the table had gone silent, the air heavy with disbelief and fear. My father's breathing was ragged. My mother's hands trembled, and yet no one moved to help me. Lying there on the polished floor, I felt the distance between me and the people I had once called family stretch into an impossible canyon. The heat of betrayal burned hotter than the fracture in my arm. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat a reminder that I was alone in this room, alone in this family, and no one cared enough to stop what had just happened. The silence swallowed me whole. The paramedics lifted me onto the gurney, their voices calm and steady, as the wheels rattled over the hardwood floor and into the waiting ambulance. The cold night air slapped against my face as the doors closed behind me, sealing me in with the wail of the siren. I cradled my arm against my chest, my body shaking from both the pain and the shock. Every bump in the road sent another wave of fire tearing through me, and I clenched my jaw to keep from screaming again. The fluorescent lights of Denver General blurred above me as they pushed me through the sliding doors. The smell of antiseptic, sharp and sterile, filled my lungs. Nurses swarmed, checking my vitals, adjusting the IV. A doctor appeared, tall and composed, introducing himself as Dr. Harris, while his hands moved quickly over my swollen arm. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "We need an X-ray." I nodded, unable to form words. They wheeled me into a small room, the machine humming as they adjusted my arm. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood when the technician shifted me into place. The screen flickered, and even without medical training I could see it. The bone wasn't straight. The doctor pointed briefly, murmuring about a clean fracture, about casting and healing time, but his words drifted in and out. All I could think about was the sound of it breaking and the smile on Sophia's face. When they finally settled me back into a curtained bay, my arm wrapped tightly in plaster and gauze, Dr. Harris sat down beside me. He held a clipboard, his tone gentle. "It looks like a pretty straightforward break. With rest and proper care, you should heal well. We'll give you a copy of the medical report." I stared at the white cocoon around my arm. It felt foreign, heavy, as if it wasn't even part of me anymore. My chest rose and fell in short, uneven breaths. Dr. Harris hesitated before continuing. "Someone did this to you. I need to ask. Who was it?" His question sliced through me. My throat tightened, my mind flashing back to Daniel's grip and Sophia's icy smile. I wanted to say their names, to spill everything right there in that sterile room, but my voice stuck. The words felt dangerous, like a match too close to gasoline. "No one," I whispered. I just fell. He studied me, clearly unconvinced. His eyes softened, but he didn't push further. He only nodded, making a note on his chart. "If you change your mind, we're here. Injuries like this rarely happen by accident." When he left, the silence pressed in again. The steady beeping of the monitor was the only sound. I thought of my parents sitting frozen at the dinner table, of Sophia's smirk, of Daniel's hand crushing bone. I realized that in their silence, in their choice to watch and do nothing, my family had answered every question I had ever carried. The nurse returned with papers for me to sign. She explained my medication, handed me the discharge instructions, and placed the medical certificate at the foot of the bed. My eyes skimmed over the words, "Fracture of the ulna patient, advised to avoid strain follow-up in 2 weeks." The clinical language made it feel detached, as if my pain was only a case file, not the ruin of trust and blood ties. I pressed my fingertips gently to the cast. The throbbing pain radiated upward, but deeper than that was the raw ache in my chest. I had been hurt before by their words, their comparisons, their indifference, but this was different. This was proof. Proof that I was not safe among them. Proof that love in that house had always been conditional, and now it had been stripped bare. I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillow, staring at the ceiling tiles that stretched endlessly above me. The truth settled heavy and unshakable inside my chest. Whatever I had once believed about family, whatever I had tried to salvage, was gone. As the nurse dimmed the light and told me to rest, I clutched my good hand against my stomach and shut my eyes. The cast around my arm wasn't just a cage for broken bone. It was a reminder that I had finally crossed a line. My family wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was the place where I had been broken. I lay awake in the hospital bed, the beeping of the monitor steady in the dark, and memories I had spent years burying clawed their way back to the surface. They came uninvited, sharp and vivid, pulling me into a time when the wounds were smaller, but just as cutting. I was 9, standing in our kitchen in Boulder, watching my mother stir a pot of soup. Sophia sat at the counter with her homework spread out, her handwriting neat and perfect, even at that age. I had just brought home a drawing from school, a messy watercolor of a tree under a bright sun. I placed it carefully on the counter, hoping for a smile, maybe even a proud word. My mother glanced at it for half a second, before setting it aside with a damp dish towel. She turned back to the pot, her voice absent. "You should try to be more like Sophia. Look how well she does in school. Look how tidy her work is." Sophia tilted her head toward me, her eyes shining with the satisfaction of being the chosen one. I shrank into myself, the warmth of my small accomplishment dissolving in an instant. That was the first time I realized I would never be enough in her eyes or in theirs. Another memory surfaced sharper, louder. We were in the living room one Christmas morning. I was 11, Sophia was 9. There had been one gift left under the tree, a polished wooden jewelry box with tiny brass hinges. I reached for it, but Sophia's hand darted out quicker. "Mine," she announced, clutching it to her chest. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "It's for both of us." She looked at me, then at our parents, who were too busy pouring coffee to intervene. With a sly grin, she opened the lid, revealing the velvet lining, and held it up like a trophy. "If it was meant for you, it wouldn't be this pretty. You break everything you touch." Her words stung more than her shove when she pushed me back. I remember falling against the arm of the couch, blinking away the tears, as my parents laughed faintly at something on the morning news, not even turning their heads. Sophia's giggle echoed louder than the carols on the radio. The memories shifted again, but this time I wasn't a child anymore. I was 16, sitting at the dining table with my textbooks spread around me. My father's checkbook was on the counter, and Sophia, just 14, leaned over it with her curious eyes. "Dad," she asked, her voice light and innocent on the surface, but her gaze was sharp-focused. "When you and Mom aren't here anymore, who gets the house? Will Olivia get the car? Or will everything go to me since I'm the younger one?" My father chuckled uneasily, brushing her question away with a wave of his hand, but I caught the flicker of interest in her eyes. It wasn't a child's curiosity. It was something colder, hungrier. She wanted to know the rules of the game, and even then I knew she was already planning how to win. I closed my eyes in the hospital bed, but the memories kept replaying. The way she had looked at me that day, the way her lips tightened, as if she was filing away answers, calculating her future. It wasn't the curiosity of a sister. It was the ambition of someone who would cut through anything that stood in her way, even blood. I saw her face again, as it had been at dinner, smiling, while my arms snapped under her husband's grip. It was the same look she had worn as a teenager, when she asked about inheritance, the same glint of triumph from the Christmas morning she took what was mine. My cast itched, my chest tightened, and I realized it had always been there. The hunger, the need to prove I was less so she could shine brighter, the ambition that didn't care about the cost. The nurse walked by, quietly checking on the patient next to me, and for a moment the present came back into focus. The hospital, the beeping monitors, the sterile air. But the truth had settled deep in me now, undeniable. Sophia had been waiting for her moment all along, and I had seen the proof in her eyes years before. I just hadn't wanted to believe it. I turned my head against the pillow, staring at the shadows crawling across the ceiling. The fracture in my arm would heal, the bruises would fade, but the crack that had split through my trust had been forming since childhood. And now it was wide open, impossible to ignore. The discharge papers were still sitting on my nightstand when the email arrived. I was sitting in my small apartment in Aurora, my arm propped up on pillows, trying to sip lukewarm coffee with my left hand. The notification pinged on my phone, and for a moment I thought it was another message from work or one of the few friends who had texted to check in. Instead, it was from First Mountain Bank. The subject line made my stomach drop. "Payment due on your personal loan." I blinked, certain it was a mistake. I had never taken out a loan. My pulse quickened as I opened it, scanning the words that blurred in front of me. "Balance outstanding $25,000. Past due by 10 days. My good hand trembled as I clicked through the attached PDF. It was a contract with my name typed neatly at the top, my social security number, my address. At the bottom, there was a signature that looked like mine, but it wasn't. The curves were too stiff, the slant too forced. My chest tightened, heat rising to my face. I called the bank immediately. The phone pressed against my ear as I paced my small living room, my cast bumping against my side. The representative answered with a polite tone, asking for my details. I gave them, my voice breaking. "I never applied for this loan. There's been a mistake." There was a pause, the sound of typing. "Ma'am, we have a signed contract on file. The funds were deposited last month into a joint account under your name." Joint account. My heart hammered. I only had one checking account, and it was mine alone. I forced my voice steady. "Whose name is on the account with mine?" Another pause, longer this time. The representative cleared his throat. A Daniel Harper. The room tilted around me. I clutched the edge of the couch, my knuckles white. Of course it was him. Daniel. My brother-in-law. My attacker. The man who had snapped my arm while my sister watched. I demanded documentation, and within an hour, another email arrived. This time it was an activity log, every step tracked, every keystroke recorded. I scrolled through in disbelief. The loan application had been submitted from an IP address linked to a residential connection in Littleton. The address on file belonged to Daniel and Sophia. It felt like ice water poured down my back. Not only had he broken me physically, he had stolen from me, crafted a paper trail to chain me with debt I had never agreed to. And Sophia, my sister who had smiled while I collapsed. She had sat in that house while he used my name, my information to dig me deeper into a pit I hadn't built. I leaned back against the wall, sliding down until I was on the floor, my cast pressed tight against my chest. Tears blurred my vision, but behind them was something harder, sharper. They weren't careless. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. A choice. I called the bank again, demanding to know what my options were. The woman on the line explained in the same calm tone that I would need to file a fraud report, provide evidence, maybe even involve the police. Her words were practical, detached, but to me, they were confirmation of the nightmare. To fight this, I would have to drag it into the open. When the call ended, I sat in silence, staring at the contract glowing on my laptop screen. I traced the forged signature with my eyes. It looked so close to mine that anyone glancing would believe it. And that was the point. They wanted me buried under suspicion, doubting my own reality, trapped in a debt I could never escape. I thought back to every moment Sophia had asked about inheritance, about who would get what when our parents were gone. It had never been curiosity. It had been hunger. And now she and Daniel weren't waiting for the future. They were carving pieces out of me while I was still breathing. The anger surged so suddenly it startled me. My chest heaved as I pushed myself off the floor. My apartment felt too small, too suffocating. I opened the window, letting the cold Colorado air cut against my skin. It didn't calm me. It only sharpened the truth. They wanted me broken. They wanted me discredited, in debt, isolated. First the arm, now my name. It was a pattern, a design, a trap. The cast on my arm itched and throbbed, a constant reminder of what they had already taken. But staring at that forged contract, seeing Daniel's name tied to mine in a joint account I had never touched, I felt something else ignite beneath the fear. It was the certainty that this wasn't over. I closed the laptop, my breathing slow and heavy. For the first time since that dinner, I didn't feel like a victim cowering in the dark. I felt like someone who had finally seen the blueprint of the betrayal. And now that I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The night outside was still and cold, the city lights blinking in the distance. I stood at the window, my reflection pale and hollow-eyed in the glass. The contract, the false debt, the signature, the IP address. It was all evidence. And evidence meant I wasn't powerless. The following Monday, I walked into the office with my cast hidden under the sleeve of a loose blazer, hoping to keep questions to a minimum. My body was sore and my mind heavier, but I clung to the thought that I still had evidence on my side. The front desk receptionist gave me a strange look when I passed her, polite smile thinner than usual. Whispers followed me down the hallway like a draft through an old house. At my desk, a message light blinked red on my phone. Before I could press play, my inbox chimed with a meeting request from Human Resources. The sender was Karen Lewis, the HR manager known for her sharp tone and stricter-than-script rules. My stomach tightened. The meeting was in 15 minutes. When I walked into the HR office, Karen was already waiting, her lips pressed into a straight line. On the desk between us was a folder with my name written across it in black marker. She gestured for me to sit, and I lowered myself carefully into the chair, my cast thumping against the armrest. "Olivia," she began, folding her hands. "I've had several concerning reports about your behavior recently. Colleagues are worried about your stability." I blinked at her, stunned. Stability. The word felt like a slap. She opened the folder, sliding out a printed email. It was unsigned, an anonymous submission to HR claiming I had been erratic, paranoid, and spreading wild accusations about my family. It described me as unfit to continue in a professional environment. My chest constricted. Daniel. It had his fingerprints all over it, his voice hidden in someone else's words. Karen continued, her tone cool. Given the seriousness of these concerns, we're considering a temporary unpaid leave of absence. It would give you time to address these personal challenges without disrupting the workplace. I felt heat surge up my neck. My voice cracked as I tried to steady it. I haven't done anything irrational. My work is consistent, my deadlines are met. Please don't tell me you believe this garbage. Karen's brow furrowed. She slid another paper forward, this one a formal warning letter. It was already typed, the company logo at the top, my name in bold. She uncapped a pen, the blue ink hovering above the signature line. For a moment I thought the ground would open beneath me. First, the forged loan, now my job. Piece by piece, Daniel was stripping me down until there was nothing left. If I lost my job, I would have no income, no stability, no way to fight back. I opened my mouth desperate when the office door creaked open. A figure stepped inside without knocking. It was Mark Evans, one of the senior analysts I had worked with for years. His graying hair was messy from rushing his tie crooked. Karen looked up sharply. "Mark, we're in the middle of something." He ignored her and turned to me. "Olivia, I heard what's happening. This isn't right." My throat tightened. He had been kind to me before, offering advice, checking in during stressful projects, but now he stood like a shield. Karen's expression hardened. "This is confidential. You shouldn't be here." Mark crossed his arms. "I don't care. I've reviewed her performance myself. She's one of the most reliable people in this department. If you put her on leave over anonymous claims, you're making a mistake." The pen in Karen's hand hovered uncertainly. My pulse hammered in my ears as I watched the tension rise in the room. Mark leaned forward, his voice firm. "If anyone deserves scrutiny, it's whoever submitted that anonymous report. Hiding behind lies to sabotage a colleague should be the real concern." For the first time, Karen's mask cracked. She set the pen down slowly, glancing between us. The silence stretched until it pressed against my ribs. Finally, she closed the folder with a snap. "This will be postponed for now," she said flatly. "But we'll revisit the matter if more complaints arise." The words landed heavy, but the paper was not signed. My job was not gone. Not yet. I exhaled shakily, gripping the arm of my chair as Mark put a hand on my shoulder. The gratitude in my chest tangled with dread. Daniel's reach was long, but for the first time someone had pushed back. When I left the HR office, the whispers in the hallway didn't sting as much. I still had a target on my back, but at least one voice had cut through the lies. And it meant Daniel and Sophia weren't the only ones writing the story. The morning after the HR meeting, I sat in my apartment staring at the cast around my arm, the throbbing pain making every movement clumsy. My laptop sat open on the kitchen table, pages of legal searches blinking back at me. Fraud, assault, harassment. Words that used to belong to news articles now hovered above my own life. I needed help, and not from a sympathetic coworker or a nurse with kind eyes. I needed someone who could turn the chaos into order. That was how I found Michael Evans, a civil attorney in downtown Denver. His office smelled of coffee and leather, the shelves stacked with heavy law books that looked like they could crush me if they toppled. He was calm, his voice even as he listened to my story. I told him about the dinner, the broken arm, the forged loan, the HR ambush. My words tumbled out in fragments, my throat tightening as I relived each moment. When I finally stopped, Michael leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "Olivia, what you are describing is a pattern. This isn't a family squabble. This is targeted abuse, financial fraud, and intimidation. You need protection. Protection." The words stuck in my mind like a handhold on a cliff. Michael explained the process of requesting a temporary restraining order, a TRO. It was paperwork and a hearing, a judge who could decide within minutes if Daniel should be legally ordered to stay away. His voice was steady, pragmatic, but I felt the tremor in my chest grow. Facing Daniel in a courtroom even for a few minutes made my stomach turn. Still, I signed the forms with my good hand, the pen shaking between my fingers. Michael assured me he would file them immediately. By the end of the week, I had a court date. The courthouse felt colder than the hospital, though the sun streamed through tall glass windows. My cast itched under my sleeve as Michael guided me through the security check and down a hallway that smelled of dust and floor polish. He spoke quietly, coaching me on what to expect. A short hearing, direct questions from the judge, my chance to describe the violence and threats. When we stepped into the courtroom, Daniel was already there. His suit was too polished, his posture arrogant. Sophia sat behind him, her smile faint but poisonous, as if the entire room were her stage. My knees weakened, but Michael's steady hand on my elbow kept me upright. The judge entered, a stern woman with steel gray hair and a voice that carried without effort. She glanced between us, her eyes sharp. "Ms. Carter, tell me what happened." My voice trembled, but I forced it out. The dinner, the attack, the fracture, the hospital records. I explained the loan. I never signed the HR ambush, the way Daniel had pulled the strings behind the curtain. Every detail burned as it left my lips, but each word was anchored by the memory of the cast wrapped tight around my arm. Daniel smirked, shaking his head, as if it were all a performance. When the judge turned to him, he spread his hands casually. "She is exaggerating. Families argue. She tripped, she panicked. Now she is trying to ruin my name." The judge's gaze didn't waver. She looked at the medical report Michael had submitted, the bank documents, the HR letter. Evidence weighed more than charm. After a pause that stretched too long for my heart, she spoke clearly. "The court grants a temporary restraining order. Mr. Brooks, you are ordered to remain at least 100 yards from Ms. Carter, her home and her workplace until further review." Relief and terror crashed over me at once. The words were protection, but they also lit a fuse. Daniel's jaw tightened, then he laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed against the wood panels. "Paper cannot keep me away forever," he sneered. The bailiff's glare silenced him, but the damage was done. His words lodged in my mind, a threat hidden in plain view. Michael gathered the papers from the clerk and handed them to me outside the courtroom. His voice was calm, but firm. "This is a start. It gives us time to build your case. Do not let his reaction shake you. The law is on your side." I nodded, clutching the documents against my chest. The seal of the court glinted in the light, a fragile shield between me and the storm. My body shook, not from pain, but from the knowledge that the battle had only begun. When I stepped out of the courthouse, the Denver air felt heavier than before. The city moved around me, oblivious to the war that had just been declared. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about fighting back. The evening after the hearing, I returned to my apartment exhausted, but restless. Sleep refused to come, and I sat by the window watching the glow of street lamps bleed across the sidewalk. That was when I heard a knock, gentle but insistent. I opened the door to find Henry, my neighbor from 2 floors down, holding a small flash drive in his hand. He looked uneasy, his eyes darting down the hallway before meeting mine. "Olivia, I think you need to hear this." He pressed the drive into my palm as though it burned. My stomach twisted as I led him inside. When I plugged it into my laptop and hit play, static filled the speakers before voices cut through. It was Daniel's, sharp and cruel, echoing as though caught in the heat of an argument. "She will never see it coming. All we have to do is make her look unstable, and everyone will side with us." Then Sophia's voice, colder than I remembered, slid into the room. "You're right. If she loses her job, her apartment, her credibility, what's left? Nobody listens to the weak." I froze, bile rising in my throat. Henry sat across from me, wringing his hands. "I caught them arguing outside in the parking lot last week. I've got a security camera in my window. It records sound too. This is just a clip. There's more on the drive." The words looped in my head, each one driving deeper into the cracks Daniel and Sophia had already carved. This wasn't just malice. It was premeditated, deliberate, and careless enough to be caught. My chest tightened with both fury and something I hadn't felt in weeks, hope. Evidence. Their own voices condemning themselves. Henry leaned forward, his voice low. I also have video. The camera picked up some of their movements near your car, near your door. I haven't pulled it yet because I thought maybe you'd want to keep it sealed until the right time. I nodded, gripping the flash drive so tightly it pressed into my skin. He was right. If I used this now, Daniel would twist it. Sophia would smirk and shrug, and somehow they would spin it into another attack on me. But in court under oath with a judge staring them down, their words would shatter their masks. Thank you, Henry, I whispered. You don't know what this means. His expression softened, and he gave a quick shake of his head. Just make sure you stay safe. They're playing a dangerous game. After he left, I sat alone with the recording still open on my laptop. Daniel's voice replayed, dripping with arrogance. Sophia's laced with venom. My hand hovered over the keyboard, tempted to send it to Michael immediately to let him know we had gold. But a colder voice inside told me to wait. Timing would decide everything. The cast on my arm itched, a reminder of what Daniel had already done. I traced the edge of the bandages and thought about how far I had been pushed. From the dinner table to the ER to a courtroom. And now in my living room, I had their confession. I closed the laptop and held the drive in both hands, pressing it against my chest as though it were a lifeline. For weeks, fear had been my shadow, my every step stalked by doubt. Tonight, I felt something shift. The scale wasn't balanced yet, but for the first time, I could see how it might be. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I leaned back against the couch, letting my body sink into the cushions, my heart racing with a mix of dread and determination. The evidence was mine now, and it was enough to make Daniel and Sophia bleed in the place they feared most, not with fists or rumors, but with truth. I whispered to the empty room, almost afraid of how much I meant it. This changes everything. The next morning, sunlight crept through the blinds, and for the first time in weeks, I woke without dread crushing my chest. I showered, dressed carefully, and drove across town to Grandma Rose's house, the little brick home that had always felt warmer than anywhere else. The lilac bush by her front steps was just beginning to bloom, and the scent reached me before I rang the bell. When she opened the door, her eyes went straight to my cast, and I saw the flicker of pain there, the kind that comes from loving someone and knowing you cannot undo what has been done. She drew me into the foyer, with that quiet strength she carried like a mantle. The house looked the same as it always had. Framed photographs on the piano, a crocheted blanket folded over the back of the couch, the porcelain lamp shaped like a peony still glowing softly in daylight. She guided me to the kitchen table and set out 2 cups of tea, then sat opposite me with her hands wrapped around her mug, as if gathering warmth before stepping into cold water. I told her about the dinner as much as I could without letting the rage steal my voice. I told her about the hospital and the bank and the hearing where the judge read the order, in a voice that sounded like a door closing. She listened without interruption, nodding slowly, eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, the kettle clicked again on the stovetop, as if the house was taking a breath for both of us. She reached across the table and rested her palm lightly against my good hand. She said that she had been afraid this day would come. The words surprised me. I asked her what she meant, and she folded her hands as if deciding which thread to pull first. She said that last year she met with a lawyer near Washington Park, a quiet man with silver hair and a spine like a fence post. She had taken a cab to his office on a bright afternoon and signed her name on several sets of papers. She said she had updated her will. She told me she wanted no more doubt about where her home and the small savings she had would go. She had left the majority to me. The words were simple, but they landed like a bell in my chest. I stared at her, the kitchen tilting slightly. She continued before I could speak. She said she loved both of us, that she had tried to be fair all our lives, but that fairness sometimes required courage. She had watched Sophia for years with a mother's eyes and a woman's intuition. She had seen the questions about houses and cars, the way Sophia's smile tightened when money was mentioned, the way her attention sharpened whenever inheritance hovered near the surface of a conversation. She said she hoped she was wrong, but she could not ignore what she had seen. I sat very still, the porcelain mug warm against my palm. Pieces began to slide into place with a terrible clarity, like a lock turning. The Christmas with the jewelry box. The nights when Sophia drifted into our father's office to watch him balance the household budget. The way she asked who would get the cabin near Estes Park if anything happened, as if death was an appointment that could be penciled in for convenience. It had seemed like curiosity then. It tasted like hunger now. Grandma rose from her chair and disappeared down the hallway. When she returned, she carried a small velvet case, the kind that belongs in a safe rather than a dresser drawer. She set it on the table and opened it with gentle fingers. Inside lay a ring slender and old, the gold warmed by age, the center set with a round opal that held milky fire. She said it had been her mother's and her mother's mother's before that. She told me that years ago she had always planned to hand it to whichever granddaughter showed the steadier heart, not the louder voice. She lifted the ring carefully and slid it into my good palm. The metal felt cool against my skin, almost weightless, and yet heavier than anything I had carried. I did not cry. My body had no tears left. Instead, a quiet steadiness spread through me like the first unfrozen stream in spring. I asked why she had not told me sooner. She said that she had hoped time would soften Sophia, that the right love or the right work would steer her toward kindness. She had waited for signs for repentance, for a hint that the child she loved had not been replaced by ambition sharpened into cruelty. When none of that arrived, she acted. We sat in silence for a while. The refrigerator hummed. A bird called from the lilac. The ring caught a thin spear of sunlight and threw it back as a small flame on the table. I could almost hear Sophia's voice from years ago, asking who gets the house, who gets the car, the tilt of her head, the cold in her eyes that I told myself was only youthful envy. It had not been youthful. It had been a map, and she had been walking it for a long time. I asked about the details. She answered without hesitation, as if she had rehearsed this day. The will had been updated and notarized. The lawyer's name was Victor Delgado. The documents were filed and stored in 2 places at the firm and in her bedroom safe. She had written a letter to accompany them, explaining her reasons without malice, anchoring them to what she had witnessed, not to gossip or suspicion. She said she knew Sophia would be furious. She said she still hoped anger would lead to reflection, that reflection would lead to change, but that she would not put her home into hungry hands out of fear. I thought of Daniel's laughter in the courtroom. Paper cannot keep me away forever. He had no idea that there was more paper waiting stronger than a judge's order, older than his marriage to my sister, forged not in secrecy, but in resolve. The thought steadied me. The ring steadied me. The woman across the table steadied me most of all. Grandma asked if I was afraid. I told her the truth. Fear had been my nightly companion for weeks. It sat at the foot of my bed and followed me to the sink in the morning. But fear felt different now. It did not own me. It was simply a fact, like the cast on my arm, or the scar that would likely form where the bone had pierced skin. She reminded me to give a copy of the recording from Henry to my lawyer, and to keep the video sealed until the right moment. She said timing is part of justice. Then she patted my hand and told me to eat. She pushed a plate of toast and scrambled eggs toward me, and I swallowed around the knot in my throat, surprised at how hungry I was. The simple food grounded me, as did the gentle clink of fork against plate, as did her presence, a shelter built of years and decency. When breakfast was finished, she walked me to the living room and opened the cabinet under the peony lamp. She pulled out a fireproof envelope and handed it to me. Inside was a copy of the will and her letter. She said I should keep this one with me for now. She said that if anything happened to her, I would not be left scrambling for proof while grief chewed at my ribs. I slid the envelope carefully into my bag with the flash drive from Henry, the ring warm in my palm. On the porch, she hugged me with a strength that belied her age. She kissed my temple like she had when I was small and scraped my knees on the sidewalk. She told me she believed in me, that she had watched me choose kindness, even when it cost me comfort, and that she had never regretted placing her hope in me. I stepped down the brick path, with the sun on my face and the scent of lilac thick in the air. For a moment, I felt like I was walking out of one life and into another. In the car, I sat with the ring cupped in my hand, and let the memories settle into a single clear picture. Sophia's questions at 16, her smirk at the dinner table, the forged signature, the whisper to Daniel outside caught by a neighbor's patient lens. It was all one story, and it pointed to the same hunger that had been growing in her for years. I had kept telling myself that sisters fight, that people mature, that envy can dissolve in time. I had been wrong. I slid the ring onto my finger, carefully, feeling the band rest against my skin, like a promise. The opal flashed once, soft and steady. The envelope lay on the passenger seat, edges neat, the legal weight inside it, heavier than its size suggested. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, glancing once in the mirror at the small brick house shrinking behind me. I knew I would be back soon, and I knew that next time the world might feel more dangerous than this quiet morning. But I also knew why Sophia had smiled while I fell, and that knowledge was armor. Halfway home, the traffic slowed near the park, and I let the car idle, breathing in and out, until the knot in my chest loosened. The ring warmed under the sun that poured through the windshield. I rested my cast gently against my stomach and thought about the next step, about calling Michael, about organizing every scrap of paper into a story the court would understand. Then the light changed and I eased forward with the flow of cars, the city opening in front of me, like a page I was finally ready to write. The invitation from the church arrived in my inbox that afternoon. Pastor John Lee was hosting a community listening night in the fellowship hall and asked anyone affected by recent conflicts to come share. I stared at the message for a long time, my hand resting on the envelope holding Grandma Rose's will and the flash drive Henry had given me. The thought of speaking in front of people made my stomach twist, but avoiding the shadows felt like the whole point of fighting back. I wrote a brief reply that I would attend. The fellowship hall smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. Folding chairs made tight rows beneath the soft light of pendant lamps. A sheet cake sat untouched on a long table near a pot of decaf. People I recognized from childhood choir practices and food drives filtered in quietly, some offering me small nods, some pretending not to see the cast on my arm. Through the windows, I could see a spring dusk settling over the parking lot, the sky deepening into indigo. Pastor John stepped to the front and welcomed everyone. He said the purpose was simple. Listen. No shouting, no accusations, no cross-examination. He asked anyone who wished to speak to do so from the heart and keep to facts. He added that the church was not a courtroom, but truth belonged here too. His voice was steady and kind, and for a moment my breath loosened. I raised my hand before I could talk myself out of it. I walked to the front slowly, the weight of every eye a tide against my chest. I told them my name, even though everyone knew it. I told them that 2 weeks earlier a dinner at my parents' house ended with my arm broken and a trip to the hospital. I kept my voice level and factual. I said that the judge had granted a temporary restraining order that prohibited Daniel Brooks from being anywhere near me. I said I was not here to argue law. I was here because silence had become its own kind of harm. A murmur moved through the room like wind through cotton. Pastor John thanked me and asked if I wanted to sit or continue. I said I would continue for a moment. I told them a neighbor had shared something with me. I said it involved words spoken in anger outside an apartment building where sound travels farther than people think. I took the flash drive out of my pocket and looked at Pastor John. He nodded once and moved aside so I could set the small player on the table and press play. Static. Then Daniel's voice filled the room, brittle and sure. She will never see it coming. Make her look unstable. Everyone will side with us. A breath later, another voice. Sophia. Calm, clipped, unmistakable. She loses her job, then her apartment. Then there is nothing left. Nobody listens to the weak. Gasps rose like a flock taking off. Someone coughed. Someone whispered my name. I pressed stop. The hall rang with the quiet that follows a bell. I said that there was more on the drive and other evidence that I would keep for court. I was not here to litigate. I was here to ask the people who raised me, taught me Sunday school, brought casseroles when my mother had the flu to hear me. I was not crazy. I was not inventing a story because I could not let go of old sibling rivalries. I stood beneath the simple cross on the wall and tried to look at faces instead of the floor. A chair scraped. My sister stood up near the middle row. She had dressed for an audience, sleek dress, perfect hair, a smile that barely hid her teeth. She said I should be ashamed of playing edited audio. She said the church should know that my life had been a pattern of dramatics. She said I was mixing up disagreements with crimes, that I had always done this, that I twisted things. Her voice rose. People shifted in their seats. Pastor John lifted a hand for calm. He said both sisters would be heard. He asked Sophia to speak without attacking character. He reminded her that the TRO applied to Daniel and not to her, and that everyone understood the difference between an allegation and proof. He invited Sophia to share what she knew. Sophia came down the aisle and stopped a few feet from me, keeping space like the aisle itself was a line she could not cross. She said that families fight. She said that audio can be cut. She said I had always been jealous. She laughed without humor and said if I thought an email or two about my behavior could ruin me, I was more fragile than she remembered. An email or two hung in the air like smoke. A couple of heads turned. Pastor John tilted his head slightly. He asked what emails she was referring to. Sophia blinked. She said everyone sends emails, that it was obvious I had been struggling and people had reached out to my job out of concern. She said concern twice. She waved a hand toward me and said if I had nothing to hide, an HR check-in should not matter. She spoke quickly, the way people do when they are paddling hard beneath the surface. Henry stood from the back row, almost apologetic, and lifted his hand. He said he lived in the same building as me. He said he had given me audio that had been captured on his window camera audio that had not been edited beyond clipping dead air. He said he had more, and that he had seen people near my door at odd hours. He said he would give everything to the court when asked. He kept his eyes on Pastor John, as if to anchor himself. Sophia pivoted toward him and called him a nosy old man. She said he had no right to record people. She said it would never hold up, because without the right subject lines tied to the incident, there was nothing to link anything. The phrase subject lines rolled out of her mouth like she had just remembered the exact words. A rumble moved through the chairs. People glanced at one another. Pastor John lifted his hand again, calm as a metronome. He asked Sophia again what she meant by subject lines. She faltered and said she meant that gossip has a way of being misfiled, minor disagreements becoming scandals. She reached for a smile and came up with a grimace. She said she did not need to explain herself to a room full of people who had always preferred me because I pretended to be good. Her voice sounded thin, like a violin string tuned too tight. I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not yet. A steadiness that came from watching someone finally reveal the corner of the map they had hidden. I told the room that I would not be sharing email screenshots here tonight. I said those belonged in court where context and authentication could be established. I said that if anyone wanted to talk to me privately afterward, I would be here by the coffee. I said my only purpose tonight was to state plainly that I had been hurt and that a plan had been spoken aloud to hurt me further. From the front row, Mrs. Diaz, who used to pass out crayons to kids during the sermon, lifted her chin and asked me softly if I was safe. The question unhooked something behind my sternum. I told her the TRO and the police were aware. I told her I had a lawyer. I told her I was staying with a friend when I needed to, and that my building had cameras and an attentive neighbor. I said I was careful. A man I did not know well stood and said he taught Sunday school with Daniel once, and that he had never liked the way Daniel joked about breaking people. He said joke was not the right word. He sat down without meeting anyone's eyes. A woman who sang alto in the choir said she had seen Sophia outside my parents' house the night after the dinner, pacing and speaking into her phone, saying that HR emails were better than police reports because they stuck without charges. She blinked when she realized what she had repeated and pressed a hand to her mouth. Sophia laughed again, too loud this time. She called the room a circus. She said none of this proved anything. She said if emails existed, they would show I had been spiraling for a while, that people were trying to help. She said help like a blade. Pastor John thanked her. He said help looks like safety and clarity and accountability. He said help does not look like ambushes. He asked the room to pray for truth and healing and for wisdom for those who would eventually hear testimony under oath. He asked anyone who had first-hand observations to write them down for me or for the police if they felt more comfortable. He said the church would not be a place where cruelty hid behind pretty language. We bowed our heads, and a quiet fell that was not the hush of shock, but the gentler quiet of people remembering who they meant to be. I did not close my eyes. I watched Sophia's jaw clench. I watched her throat move when she swallowed. She looked smaller than she had at the start of the night, after the prayer chairs scraped and people lined up for coffee. Some stopped to touch my good shoulder. Some whispered that they had wondered why I had disappeared from choir. A few looked guilty. Henry came over and said he would keep the videos sealed and time-stamped. He said he had printed a simple log of dates and times if Pastor John wanted it for reference. He handed me a folded page. I slid it into my bag with the envelope and the flash drive. Sophia lingered near the door like she wanted to be intercepted, or like she wanted to be seen leaving. She caught my eye for a second. Her face was pale beneath her makeup. She said loudly that she would not be part of a smear campaign and that she had nothing to hide. She said nothing to hide twice. Then she walked out into the parking lot and let the door close behind her with a hard click. I helped stack chairs. I thanked Pastor John. He asked if I had support to get home. I said yes. When I stepped outside, the night had turned crisp. The lamps cast pools of light on the asphalt. My car sat alone at the far end exactly where I had left it. I stood there with my hand on the roof and felt the first clean strand of hope I had felt in a long time. Not the wild flame that burns out, the steady kind that holds shape. I did not press play again on the recording. I did not pull out the folded log. I kept my evidence where it belonged and let the whispers I had not started find their own path. In the rearview mirror, the church doors swung open and closed as people drifted into the night, their voices low, their eyes thoughtful, the story no longer only mine to carry. The Arapahoe County Justice Center rose out of the morning like a stern rectangle of glass and stone. I walked through the doors with Michael at my side, the rotunda echoing with footsteps and murmured directions. My cast was lighter now but still stiff, a white reminder against the black of my blazer. We cleared security and rode the elevator in silence. When the doors opened, the hallway smelled faintly of floor polish and coffee, the kind of scent that clings to long days. Inside the courtroom, the benches creaked as people settled. My parents sat toward the back, my mother rigid, my father staring at his hands. Sophia took a seat near the aisle in a pale suit that tried to look innocent. Daniel sat at counsel table beside his attorney, his jaw set. He looked at me once, and then away as if the sight of me inconvenienced him. The judge entered, a woman with a calm face and eyes that seemed to take in a great deal without moving. She reviewed the motions on the docket, then called our case. Michael stood and announced our appearance. The district attorney had filed charges for assault and for the financial fraud tied to the forged loan. It would be a bench trial on the misdemeanor assault and an evidentiary hearing on the fraud counts to determine probable cause for a jury. The words moved around me like gears locking into place. Michael began with the simple spine of the story. He said a family dinner ended in a broken arm. He said hospital staff recorded a clean fracture and that the medical record was before the court. He said a loan appeared with my name and a signature that mimicked mine, that funds flowed into an account I had never authorized, and that the application originated from an address linked to Daniel Brooks. He added that the bank audit logs and IP traces were attached as exhibits. He said there was audio from a neighbor that captured a conversation between Daniel and Sophia about a plan to discredit me at work and at home. He said there were emails written by Sophia that referenced reaching out to my employer and keeping subject lines vague to avoid scrutiny. He called me first. My voice shook at the start, but steadied as I described the dinner, the grip on my arm, the sound that still woke me at night. I told the judge about the ambulance, the x-rays, the cast that wrapped my forearm like a plaster cocoon. I did not look at Daniel while I spoke. I looked at the judge and at the seal on the wall and at my hands, and I kept to facts. The prosecutor called the attending physician from Denver General by video link. He identified the medical record and confirmed that the fracture was consistent with a twisting force. He spoke in the precise, quiet way of someone who had stood under cross-examination many times. Daniel's attorney asked if a fall could cause the same injury. The doctor said it could, but the pattern was more consistent with force applied by another person. He did not speculate beyond that. He did not need to. Next came the bank investigator, a woman in a navy dress with a badge clipped to her belt. She explained the audit trail for the online loan application. She said the submission originated from a residential IP assigned to an address in Littleton. She said the joint account that received the funds listed my name and the name Daniel Harper Brooks. The middle name dropped into the room like a stone. It matched the stray detail that had once confused me when the bank first called. It connected the records to the person sitting at counsel table in an unbroken line. Michael moved through the exhibits like a man laying planks across a river. He offered the audit logs. He offered the bank's record of device fingerprints and the timestamps that matched evenings when I was home alone nursing a broken arm. He offered the signed loan document with a signature that looked like mine from across the room, but faltered under the close lens of a document examiner who testified next and pointed to tremors and unnatural hesitations. Then Henry took the stand. He looked smaller up there, but his voice was steady. He explained the security camera on his window, that it captured both video and audio of the parking lot below. He said he had provided a clean copy to law enforcement, that a forensic technician had verified the integrity of the file. The clip played on a small screen. Daniel's voice out of the night air, confident and cruel. Sophia's voice was cool and strategic, as she spoke about making me look unstable about job and apartment, and the usefulness of pressure. A ripple moved through the gallery, not the gasps of the church hall this time, but a lower sound like an intake of breath shared by many. Sophia's name on the email exhibits came next. Michael did not splash every line across the courtroom. He chose a few. One to an HR contact at my company's general inbox, written from an address that matched her phone records, suggesting the company check in on an employee who had been spiraling. One to Daniel, with a note that subject lines should mention wellness check, and not complaint that it would keep the exchange out of the wrong folders. One to a mutual acquaintance, saying that sometimes you have to stage an intervention to protect a family's reputation. The judge read silently, and then looked up at Sophia. Her face had gone chalky under the makeup. Daniel's attorney rose and tried to hack at the structure. He said the audio was taken without consent. He said the bank records could be spoofed. He said the emails were out of context. He said I had invented a villain because I needed one. He asked me whether I had been drinking at dinner, and whether I had ever struggled with anxiety. The courtroom went quiet enough to hear the fluorescent lights hum. I answered without drama. I said I had a glass of wine with dinner. I said I had never been treated for anxiety. I said none of that gave anyone the right to put their hands on me, or to put a debt in my name. Michael stood again and kept his questions clean. He asked the doctor to explain one last time the kind of force that causes a spiral fracture. He asked the bank investigator whether the application had used two-factor authentication tied to a phone number belonging to Daniel. She said it had. He asked Henry whether he had edited the audio. Henry said he had only clipped dead air and turned up the volume. He asked the document examiner whether the signature on the loan matched the exemplars of my signature. The examiner said no. Then Michael played the video clip Henry had withheld until now. The screen showed the parking area outside my building, time-stamped grainy but clear enough. Daniel near my car on a night I had reported hearing footsteps. Sophia a few minutes later pacing and speaking into her phone. The clip ended with the two of them walking toward the back staircase as if the evening were theirs to map. The judge leaned forward slightly. She asked Daniel's attorney whether he wished to present anything further. The defense called Sophia. She sat very straight and tried to soften her voice. She said she never intended harm. She said she had only been worried. She said she had sent emails out of concern. She said the audio made her sound cold because everyone sounds cold when they are recorded. She did not look at me. The judge asked her one question. Did you instruct anyone to contact the employer of the complaining witness in a manner designed to make that witness look unstable? Sophia hesitated. She said she suggested a wellness check. The judge let the word hang there and moved on. Finally, Daniel spoke. He said I had fallen. He said he had reached for me, and the accident had taken us both by surprise. He said the loan was my idea, and that he had only helped with the application as a favor. He said he did not know why I was making such a mess of things. The judge called a recess, then returned with a face that gave nothing away. She spoke carefully and slowly. She said the court found the testimony of the medical expert credible and consistent with a non-accidental injury. She said the audio and video were admissible and persuasive. She said the bank records and document examination established probable cause to bind the fraud counts over for trial and that a separate setting would be scheduled. She said on the charge before her, the court found Daniel Brooks guilty of misdemeanor assault under Colorado law. She said the evidence also supported a finding that Sophia Bennett had acted in concert to interfere with employment and to contribute to a campaign of intimidation, and that those facts would be referred to the district attorney for charging and considered in a permanent protective order hearing. No one moved. The words sat like stones in a still pond. Daniel stared at the table as if willing it to rise and shield him. Sophia's mouth opened and closed. My mother pressed a hand to her throat. My father closed his eyes. Michael placed a copy of the ruling in my hand and whispered that we had more steps ahead, but that today mattered. The bailiff called the next case. The courtroom rustled back to life. I stood slowly, the paper warm against my palm. It felt like a door had opened behind me, and another had closed in front of me. Outside in the corridor, the light looked different, cleaner somehow, and the echo of the judge's voice followed me out like a bell that would take a long time to stop ringing. News traveled faster than I expected. By the time I stepped into the sun outside the courthouse, my phone was buzzing like a trapped insect. Messages stacked in bright rectangles on the screen, some from coworkers, some from numbers I did not recognize, a few from neighbors who had been in the church hall. I ignored them and let the sound fade in my pocket. I needed a quiet space in my head before I let anyone else inside it. Michael and I walked to the parking lot in silence. He said there would be more hearings for the fraud case and that his office would coordinate with the district attorney. He reminded me to keep every document in order to save every message, to forward anything that smelled like pressure or retaliation. I nodded and thanked him and promised I would. We parted with a calm that felt like a truce with the world. On the drive back to Aurora, I saw a notification flash that made me pull into a gas station and park beneath the harsh white lights. It was a news alert from a local business journal. A brief story said that Front Range Realty Group had terminated an executive following a misdemeanor conviction connected to a domestic incident, and that the company had released a statement about its commitment to safety and ethics. They did not name him, but they did not need to. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. The narrative had finally shifted, and it was not mine alone to carry anymore. I sat there a long time with the engine off, listening to the clicks as the car cooled. The gas station clerk swept the lot in patient circles. Across the street, a mother pushed a stroller, the small shape inside swaddled against the wind. Ordinary life went on, while the fault line in mine finally moved. When I reached my apartment, Mark from work had left a voicemail. He said the HR warning had been rescinded, pending the outcome of the case, and that leadership had asked him to extend support. His words were careful, but beneath them I heard something like respect. I pressed the phone to my chest and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped for months. By evening, another message came, this one from a mutual acquaintance who had always orbited Sophia. She said the group chat she and Sophia shared had gone quiet after the verdict. She said a few of them had reached out to Sophia and gotten responses that were clipped and defensive. She said people were reconsidering what they had accepted as truth for a long time. She did not apologize for herself, not yet, but her tone had changed. The next day, Pastor John called and asked if I felt comfortable attending Sunday service. He said the church had been receiving questions, and he wanted to make sure I would not be blindsided by curiosity or cruelty. I told him I would come and that I could handle curiosity. Cruelty would have to stand out in the light now. Sunday morning, the sanctuary smelled like wood polish and lilies. Sunlight slanted through stained glass and made the pews glow. My cast rested on the Bible shelf in front of me while I tried to slow my breathing. Pastor John preached about justice that is gentle and firm, about grace that does not excuse harm, about truth that can hurt and heal in the same breath. After the benediction, people shuffled toward the fellowship hall, voices low, children weaving between legs, the old rhythms of a community trying to remember itself. I saw my father near the coffee table pouring a cup with hands that shook. He looked older than he had in court, the lines around his mouth deeper, his posture stooped as if the air had grown heavy. When he saw me, he walked over and stopped, and for a heartbeat, he seemed unsure of how to begin. He had always been a man of quiet gestures rather than speeches. He cleared his throat and told me he had failed me. He said he had chosen calm over courage for years, and that calm had given shelter to what should have been challenged. He said he was sorry in a voice that sounded scraped raw. The words did not fix anything, but they did not feel small. I put my good hand on his sleeve and told him I heard him. His shoulders dropped, and he exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for years. My mother stood a few feet away, watching us, her face a careful arrangement of dignity and alarm. She wore a navy dress I had seen at weddings and funerals, a dress for events where people might cry. She waited for us to move toward her. I did not. My father turned to her and spoke with a steadiness I had not heard from him before. He asked whom she thought she had been protecting all this time. He asked it without anger, like a question in a catechism that needed a real answer. She frowned and said that families are complicated. He replied that complication had become an excuse placed over harm, like a cloth over a stain. People had begun to gather in small knots nearby, their voices dropping as if our private conversation had slipped and become public by accident. Pastor John approached and stood at a respectful distance. My mother looked around and saw the circle of eyes and color rose in her cheeks. She said she had always loved both her daughters. She said she had tried to keep peace. I told her that peace without protection is not peace, it is surrender dressed up as virtue. The words surprised me with how calm they sounded. They did not shake, and they did not seek permission. My mother bristled, then faltered. She said that Sophia had always needed more guidance, that she had believed the older child could bear more, that I had seemed strong. I told her that strength chosen by others is simply abandonment in a better outfit. I asked her to look at my arm. I asked her to remember the sound that still lived inside my bones. I asked her to say what she had refused to say. For a moment it felt like we stood on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling past our ears. My mother clenched her jaw. Her eyes shone. She opened her mouth and closed it again. Then she said that she had been wrong. She said she had defended what she wanted to be true. She said she had turned away from what was. She said she had looked at me and seen a repository for resilience, and at Sophia, and seen a fragile idol that could not be chipped. She said she had abandoned me. The room shifted. It was subtle, but I felt it. People drew in a breath together, like the pews had exhaled. My father nodded once, and his hand found the space between my shoulders for a second that felt like a small benediction. Pastor John bowed his head in a quiet acknowledgement of what had just been spoken. Sophia entered the hall then later than everyone else, as if arriving after the lesson to avoid the test. Conversation stopped. She scanned the room with the quick calculation I recognized from our childhood, the look that measured which direction the power was flowing. She walked toward us and stopped a few feet away. Her gaze flicked over my cast, then over my face. She said that this was a spectacle, that churches were for hymns and baptisms, not staged confessions. My mother flinched at the word confession. My father straightened. I told Sophia that a confession is only staged if the truth is performed instead of lived. I said I was not here for theater. I was here because the quiet had nearly killed me. A woman from the choir stepped closer and asked Sophia if she had contacted my employer. Sophia said she had reached out with concern. The woman asked if concern included advising someone to use subject lines that softened accountability. Sophia looked away. The silence stretched. Someone at the coffee table set down a cup too hard, and the sound cracked across the room. My mother placed a hand on Sophia's arm. It was a familiar gesture from our childhood, the touch that had always pulled attention back to the younger sister. This time, my mother did not pull Sophia to safety. She looked at her and said that harm had been done, and that it had been done in their names and in their home. She said that she could not protect lies anymore. Sophia's face went blank in that way people learn when they want to hide in plain sight. She said nothing, and then turned and left the hall. The echo of her heels faded. People began to move again, not with the awkward sideways glances of gossip, but with a slower pace like a town recovering after a storm. Pastor John directed a few volunteers to set out plates of fruit and muffins. Someone refilled the coffee. I stood in the corner by the window and watched sunlight slide across the floorboards. My mother faced me fully. Her shoulder blades were tight under the fabric of her dress. She said she could not undo the years. She asked what I needed from her now. I told her that I needed her to stop defending what could not be defended and to tell the truth when asked. I told her that I needed her to stand still and not flinch when the consequences came. She nodded and for once did not look to my father for translation. The room emptied slowly. Neighbors came by in twos and threes, some to touch my arm gently, others to say they had been wrong to believe the worst. I did not hand out absolution. I simply listened and let their words pass over me like water over rock. When we stepped outside, the sky had that late morning brightness that makes everything look newly washed. My mother paused on the steps and bowed her head. She did not speak. The act was small and private, but it felt like a hinge in the day. My father took her hand, and for the first time in years, I felt the shape of us shift into something that might hold. I walked to my car and sat with the door open, the breeze cool against my face. The church bell in the small tower gave a single soft note from the wind. My phone buzzed again. Another notification. Another ripple reaching outward from the courtroom. I let it go to silence and closed my eyes. For a few breaths, I allowed myself to stand in the space between what had been pronounced and what would follow. The weight on my chest felt lighter, not gone, but altered. The road ahead was still long, but the direction had become undeniable. Brightline Media called me back on a Tuesday morning when the air outside still smelled of damp grass. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, telling me that the investigation into the harassment claims had concluded that the disciplinary note in my file had been removed and that the company regretted the stress caused by unfounded allegations. They invited me back to my position, and for a moment, I could not speak. My throat tightened with a mix of relief and disbelief. When I finally managed to thank you, my voice cracked. Walking back into the building later that week felt like stepping into a place I had both loved and feared. The walls were the same, the hum of printers and muted chatter unchanged, but the eyes that looked at me carried something new. A few coworkers approached quietly offering apologies wrapped in small sentences. One said they had been wrong to believe rumors. Another said they should have asked me directly instead of whispering. I nodded, accepting the words without needing to grant forgiveness. The truth had already spoken louder than any apology. Karen from HR appeared at my desk with careful steps. She placed a folder in front of me, her expression taut but open. She said she had followed procedure at the time, but admitted that fear of liability had guided her more than fairness. She told me she was sorry. I looked at her for a long moment, and then told her that fear can never be an excuse for injustice. She nodded and walked away, and for once her posture looked less certain. That evening I drove to Grandma Rose's house, the small brick bungalow on the edge of town, that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. She was waiting on the porch wrapped in a shawl despite the warm night. When I reached her, she took my hand in both of hers and pressed it firmly. Her eyes were wet but steady, as she told me that she had always known truth would outlive lies. She said she was proud of me not for winning, but for enduring without becoming cruel. I laid my head on her shoulder, and for a moment I felt like a child again, safe in a world that had nearly destroyed me. Life began to take a new shape. I found a small house of my own in a quiet neighborhood outside Denver. The first night I slept there, boxes were still stacked high, but I stood in the empty living room with the window open and listened to the crickets. The silence did not feel like suffocation anymore. It felt like space. I painted the walls pale blue, planted a few herbs in the kitchen window, and filled the shelves with books that had been packed away for too long. The house was not grand, but it was mine untainted by betrayal. News of Daniel and Sophia's downfall spread in pieces. Daniel lost his position permanently, his professional network collapsing faster than he could repair it. Eventually, the fraud charges stripped away not only his reputation, but his freedom. I read the sentencing in a short article in the Denver Post, the words stark and final. Sophia fared no better. Friends withdrew, colleagues avoided her, and whispers followed her wherever she went. She became a shadow of the woman who had once strutted with certainty, her voice no longer sharp, but hollow. I did not gloat. Watching them unravel was not joy, but confirmation that the world sometimes balances itself. One afternoon, as I unpacked a box of photographs, I found an old picture of Sophia and me as children sitting on the back steps of our childhood home. She was smiling wide, a ribbon in her hair, while I squinted into the sun. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the ache of what might have been if envy had not rotted her from the inside. I slipped the picture into a drawer. Some memories were too heavy to display. At work, projects piled up again, deadlines pressed, but the pressure felt different now. It was not laced with suspicion or whispered doubt. I earned each acknowledgement without the shadow of slander hanging above me. Mark stopped by my desk one day and said, "You didn't just survive, you changed the air around here." I smiled a small smile that held more weight than he knew. On weekends, I drove into the mountains, winding along roads that cut through pines and streams, breathing in the sharp, clean air that reminded me of resilience. I hiked trails alone, my cast long gone, my arms strong again, the memory of its break still present but no longer dominant. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Grandma Rose visited one Saturday with a tin of cookies and the heirloom locket she had promised me. She placed it in my hand and told me it had passed through generations of women who had each carried their own battles. I opened it and saw the tiny faded photo inside, a reminder that survival was not new in our family, only the shape of the struggle changed. I promised her I would keep it safe and pass it forward when the time came. As months passed, I noticed people looked at me differently. Not as a victim, not as someone fragile, but as someone who had faced fire and come through with scars that spoke instead of silenced. At first it was strange, this quiet respect. Then I let it settle, understanding that dignity is often forged in the hardest places. Sometimes I still woke at night, the sound of bones snapping, replaying in my head, the echo of my sister's smile carved into the memory. But in the mornings, I rose and opened the curtains to light that belonged only to me. The nightmares faded faster now, drowned out by the ordinary music of life starting again. I did not seek revenge with fists or fury. I let the truth unravel them thread by thread, until they stood exposed in the light they had tried to hide from. I realized that this was never about punishing them in kind. It was about refusing to carry their lies any longer. When I sat on my porch in the quiet dusk, watching the sky soften into pink and gold, I finally felt the weight lift completely. I had not erased the past, but I had rewritten its meaning. I whispered into the evening air that I did not destroy them with violence. I let the truth do what violence never could. It broke them in a way no one could deny. If this story has reached you, if it has stirred something inside you, stay with me for the journeys ahead, because there are more paths to walk, more reckonings to face, and more truths waiting to be spoken.